We're recording, folks.
Okay, hello. Welcome to the U.S. Green Buildings Council, USGBC Middle Atlantic and New England regions, and the Society of American Military Engineers, SAME, New York City Post, Resiliency Seminar Series, presented monthly in the first half of 2021. I'm Suzanne DiGeronimo, architect, president of my own firm, DiGeronimo PC, and chair of the Resiliency Committee for SAME New York City Post, your moderator today. Also on this series working group here today is Gautam Tarafdar, Regional Executive, USGBC. You missed it, January 13th, 2021, risk-reducing strategies for schools post-COVID-19. It was a rounding success. If you come back for more by attending this one, welcome back. Here we are, February 10th, economic impact of sea level rise and storm surge in the tri-state region and consequences of a no action scenario, but more on that in a minute. Upcoming March 10th, you can't miss it, is a New York City new resiliency code for flood mitigation. We have Ryan Kolkler, VP of the Innovation for Alliance for the National Community Resilience under the national auspices of the International Code Council. They testify for us before Congress, searching for the all-elusive species funding, federal funding for mitigation against disasters that we all know will make us into the resilient nation we need to be. We all know the numbers. $1 spent in mitigation provides $6 benefit in loss avoided. At this series session, we will have the New York City Building Planning Department to speak to us about the resiliency code enacted temporarily after Superstorm Sandy 9 years ago, and since codified permanently, and now in its first round of improvement. Come on out to your home computers and hear all about it. And may I remind everyone, Sandy was not a classified hurricane, rather only a reduced intensity of a superstorm. April 14th, we have rating systems for resilient building designs. Now, whereas codes have a minimal compliance standard, they're the legal standards, are really the bottom line, so to speak. Rating systems up the ante. Wanting to achieve rating systems are those firms who find resilience a desirable marketing aspect. For example, my data center ranked #1 for resilience and therefore will never close, regardless of any local national disasters. Give my data center your business. May 12th is the future of military engineering innovation for resilience. What's up for us in mitigation measures being constructed or planned by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, as funded out of Washington, D.C., and is implemented by New York District. June 9th is the science of storm surge risk reduction, a discussion of the world of outer harbor gates as implemented in other countries and here in the United States, and what a similar solution could look like here in New York Harbor. As you know, registration is open for the whole entire series. Pick them all, pick any one. Registration is a nominal fee of $10 for USGBC and SAME members, and $15 for the general public. We're considering a 7th in our series, a summit to be held in September. You can help us out. We envision a full day of worthwhile sessions. Participants can log in at their interest level as the day progresses. We're thinking of possibly bringing back the 6 series speakers for an update. We're thinking of possibly bringing in the opposition to the data presented in this series for an open debate. For example, those who say oppose the outer harbor gates paired with those who support their construction. We have a list of options for the series, sessions that you may think would be good for us in the satisfaction survey at the end of the session. We'd appreciate it if you'd look at these and indicate your interest first in holding a September summit. And then if so, we'd appreciate which sessions you think would be most interesting to you. Check all that apply or fill in your own suggestions. Medea, do you have any guidance for our audience?
Yeah, I'm just gonna email that link out to the survey after the session, so keep an eye out for that. And I'll also email you the links to the rest of the series. I believe you already have those, but I'll send them again. And just remember to look for the survey, especially if you want the PDH credits, you have to fill out the survey. And And the only other note I was going to say is thank you to our speakers, and feel free to put questions in the chat as we go along. We might take a couple pauses and interact with some questions and answers throughout instead of waiting until all of them at the end. And let us know if you need anything. Thank you.
Okay, so today, February 10th, economic impact of sea level rise and storm surge in the tri-state region and the consequences of a no action scenario. We have Dr. Alexander Heil, Vice President for Research at the Citizens Budget Commission, CBC. He is an economist, it's hard to say, with 20 years of experience and a long track record of communicating complex economic issues to a variety of listeners. He has an extensive resume of experience, such as Chief Economist for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, economist at CDM Smith, among other distinguished positions. He has an extensive teaching credits as faculty at NYU and Tufts and Emmanuel College. He holds a PhD in transportation economics from the University of South Wales in the United Kingdom, a master's degree from the Golden Gate University in San Francisco, and a bachelor's from Hawaii's Pacific University. Chris Eshleman is an urban economist and econometrician, I had to pause before I could say that, at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, focusing on statistical and forecasting, cost-benefit analysis, behavior economics, and capital projects evaluation. He holds degrees from Columbia University and the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, and the University of Pittsburgh. He is currently pursuing a degree in data science at the Harvard Extension School. So here we have today, Alex from California and Hawaii, and Chris from Alaska together in the snowy Northeast with their spectacular presentation.
All right, well, thank you, Suzanne. Kick this off here. And let me share my slides, if that works. that should bring everybody to the full slide view here. Again, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to allow us to speak to this group. We're going to talk to you a little bit about what we have estimated, and that was me in my prior role at the Port Authority together with my colleague Chris. We took a look at basically in this sort of post-Sandy environment, what would be the economic consequences of having facilities be shut down. And really the history of that sort of analysis is, for years we were asked, oh, what happens if the path system shuts down? What happens if a tunnel gets flooded? What all these sort of separate questions. And we thought we should combine them all into one and really turn this into a broad, comprehensive analysis that covers all Port Authority facilities, or most of them at least, and comes up with economic consequences of facilities not being operational. So initially, a lot of the thinking when we started this work was around, oh, what about terrorism events? And then this sort of morphed over the years and really turned into much more of a adverse climate change type events and what those effects might be. So what we're trying to accomplish here, we're going to review our analysis, we're going to review our study and estimates, and sort of provide a little bit of context in terms of how to view these kind of impacts and what this actually means for decision making, if you will. So what we tried to do at the time was all focused on the Port Authority. As you are aware, Port Authority, bi-state agency, financially independent from the two states, and operates a vast network of transportation infrastructure. What I'm showing you now is the Port District, roughly 25-mile radius around the Statue of Liberty with a real, large portfolio of sites. We try to focus on the large facilities, the airports, the port, tunnels and bridges, and you'll see in a second some of the breakdowns by facilities. But obviously, this is a massive portfolio. If you look at the region overall, there's more critical assets than we captured with our analysis. Certainly, one shouldn't be forgetting the other rail and transportation network systems, as well as other critical infrastructure. But we considering where we were sitting at the time, that's not what we focused on. So the rationale here is that, you know, from an engineering perspective and in communications with a lot of our in-house engineers at the time, there's been historically an emphasis on what is the asset destruction value. So what's the replacement value of facilities? Tunnel gets flooded, needs to be you know, going through maintenance cycle. There's another facility that gets destroyed, needs to be rebuilt. What are the costs of doing so? And we have found that it's relatively straightforward to, you know, think about this and to come up with estimates, you know, not always easy and certainly complicated, but this is sort of a standard approach. But what we're interested in as economists is really thinking about the flow concept of economic activity. So these facilities, they have value in terms of, you know, what they physically mean, certainly true, but they also facilitate economic activity. They facilitate mobility, they facilitate a volume of trade in and out of the region. And that, if it's shut down, comes with economic consequences. And what we try to then, you know, approach this with is essentially a lens of cost-benefit analysis. So in an alternative world, as a counterfactual, these facilities wouldn't be shut down, and then they provide their service. And then we basically looked at, well, in our impact case, if they are shut down for various reasons, then what activity no longer takes place, what activity gets rerouted, what activity gets slowed down. And as you can imagine, that varies greatly by asset class and by modality when it comes to transportation. And we took a look at this from the various transport modes that the agency supports. So we were not certainly alone in these kind of, you know, these kind of approaches. So as part of more detailed analysis that the Congressional Budget Office did after the disruptions on the West Coast and their port facilities, the study came out in 2006 that outlined the disruption to the freight system, logistics chain, supply chain on the West Coast, and what that meant for additional cost of shipping, additional transportation cost, inventory cost, and ultimately the economic cost, meaning the impact on the regional economy and to a certain extent also the national economy, considering LA Long Beach is really the largest port, and with it comes a lot of disrupted economic activity if it has to slow or shut down for a while. So we try to mimic what others had done. We tried to use sort of standard cost-benefit methodology that we were familiar with. And usually when you deal with these kind of cost-benefit principles, you have to define what some of these impacts might be. So in the case of a shutdown of a facility, that may mean that travelers have to reroute their trip, that they therefore need more time. There is going to be, you know, individual passenger time. There's also, this applies to the freight sector as well. There's freight time, traveling time, inventory time, logistics time that needs to be added. All of this gets valued at a unit. You know, your valuation of your personal time may be most closely approximated by your wage rate. And once we're talking about freight, then those are metrics of what's the value of the cargo and what's the cost of slowing down a delivery. Basically, what are the consequences of slowing delivery? What are the productivity impacts? And lastly, and really pretty relevant now in these, you know, pandemic months that seem to stretch forever, these sort of productivity losses. So for instance, we also covered as part of our analysis, as you will see, the World Trade Center. And the World Trade Center, you know, is a large, you know, but, you know, it's an office complex, a lot of people going in and out there, in addition to a transportation hub. And so we needed to think about what would happen to people that can no longer show up at work because the transportation mode would no longer be able to deliver them to their place of employment. So we were going to talk you through some of the details there as well. But it's important to keep in mind that, again, this is all about economic activity and not the damage to the underlying assets. That's a separate analysis. It's equally valuable, is equally part of sort of an overall trade-off between how much investment you should have to protect from future devastating consequences of climate change. That's all true, but that's not what our perspective was when we conducted this study. So a few overriding assumptions, and some of them are pretty important. So for instance, we tried to do this on a sort of a partial analysis. In other words, we assumed that whatever facility we're dealing with, that's the one that's being impacted. Everything else runs as normal. So if the path system doesn't work, then New Jersey Transit and its network was assumed to function. Now, we all know that if there's a real massive event like we saw during Sandy, then that assumption is basically no longer applicable. But for analytical purposes, what we tried to do was simply say, let's try to keep this as straightforward and as simple as we possibly can. So in other words, if one mode of transport, if one facility is no longer operating, you will be able to have a certain extent of diversion of whatever activity takes place on that mode. And that's a fairly strong assumption probably in the overall context. And so maybe, it's probably fair to say that some of these numbers that you see potentially are on the lower side of an estimate of what a true impact might be, because there's probably going to be ripple effects into other, operating systems, and that's going to cause additional damages. We understood right from the beginning that the time perspective is critical. So we did essentially 4 different analyses, which is a day-long shutdown, 3-day, 7, and 30-day shutdown. And that's important because, for instance, for freight, the decision-making by operators changes substantially if you're talking about a 1 or 2 day delay versus a month-long delay. So if it's about a couple delays, then, shippers might decide to just slow steam their vessels, and as a result of that, arrive at the port a little bit later, and that increases the cost of doing so, but it's not the end of the world. It can be absorbed within the supply chain. If the port is shut down for a month, you're not going to do that. There's going to be too much additional cost imposed on you that you really have to find a different way to bring those products to market. You either have to find a completely different route, you have to write off certain things that are maybe perishable, you maybe have to go lower on the East Coast and deliver into Savannah, Norfolk, Baltimore, and then truck up the coast, which exponentially is going to raise your cost. So there's the time dimension plays a role. And as you can also imagine, and we've all lived through this over the last year, that the time dimension when it comes to working from home, making decisions that affect productivity are equally important. So it applies to all modes across the board. And so we tried to limit it to those kind of direct effects and assume business everywhere else was pretty much undisturbed, which again, that's a fairly strong assumption to make. But you have to narrow down the scope when you conduct an assessment like this. So some of these facilities don't have local alternatives, for instance, and then that means they probably come with a larger impact. So the port, depending on how you measure it and when you look at it, is the second or third largest port in the country. And there's simply no capacity to drop off all these boxes that may arrive over a course of a month in a different port on the East Coast. So there are capacity constraints. The same applies to aviation passengers. If you're talking about 140 million passengers going in and out of the 3 big airports over the course of 12 months in pre-COVID days, then it's not entirely feasible to assume that trips can be accommodated through other ports, through other airports, and people can just make their decision and drive up to Boston, and none of that really works. So the larger the asset, the larger the disruption, the bigger the wave that all this creates. The other thing to pay attention to when we're showing you some of these estimates is that some costs, they drop off over time. Some essentially go away because decision making is altered so much that costs are pushed off to other parts of the supply chain and elsewhere. So you'll see some of these averages as they come out. So these are estimates of total economic consequence. Again, these are not asset costs of replacement. These are economic consequences, productivity losses, if you will. And the matrix shows you day of shutdown on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis shows you the facility or facility groupings. So for instance, we grouped the tunnels together to keep the analysis relatively straightforward here. This is in 2018 dollars. Now, these are not additive, so you can't just add them together. As we were just saying, one of the overriding analysis assumptions that we made was one facility is out of service, the other ones are operating. There's a certain extent of diversion that can take place, but you could already see, order of magnitude when you look at them, because of the just simply number of transactions, number of passengers, and what that means for a regional economy. The airport impact ranks at the very top with, over the course of a month, $4 billion in economic consequence to the region. Port facilities are about half that, and then the other sort of tunnels and the transit system, they rank towards the lower end of these estimates. The simple reason there is that there's a lot of diversion that takes place. So if a tunnel is flooded, the assumption is that people can travel via alternative means in and out of the city. And while there are additional costs, this is not going to be truly devastating. If the port is shut down, the iPhones from China are no longer arriving, period. Right? And then you just have to find a different route. So then the route is going to be either via the West Coast, but that requires a complete rerouting, or to a certain extent, cargo can get dropped off at the southern half of the eastern seashore. So just sort of let's jump into some of the individual transportation modes. So let me talk about ports here briefly. So again, second or third largest port in the country, has actually, on a side note, even during COVID, the port has done tremendously well. So it's probably, I didn't check the data for the West Coast ports prior to this talk, but it's probably the case that, they're sort of holding on to really, certainly the largest port on the East Coast, maybe the second largest in the country. Tremendous volume that we've seen in the region, especially the last 3 months of the year. People have been buying and demanding a whole bunch of activity. So the economic consequences, assuming a port is shut down, arise from a variety of different components. So there's delay within the logistics chain. So just think about this as a vessel that travels from China to the East Coast US. It's like a floating warehouse. And the longer that it floats, the more you have to pay for storage cost. And in addition to the storage cost, there's a transportation element by itself that would also then be triggered once you're talking about rerouting of the cargo. A lot of the cost increases, in this chain of, first the cargo traveling on water and then traveling by truck or rail. The transportation cost may be in that second part, the rail and the truck portion of it. So for instance, if you all of a sudden needed to drop off containers lower down south of New York and truck it up the coast so that you can meet consumer demand here in the region, then it may cost, I don't know, $1,000, $1,500 to truck up a box from Norfolk or a port like that. And as you can see, that's going to increase tremendously what these transportation costs are. I'll give you order of reference. So, for an ocean traveling container, maybe depending on the rates, highly competitive and also varies greatly, but maybe it costs anywhere between $1,000 and $1,200 to ship it from China to the East Coast US. So if you're then saying that you have to add another $1,000 for trucking costs because you couldn't go into the New York City port, this no longer becomes an economically feasible calculation because the costs become a tremendous burden at that point. The sort of the third consequence in the port is just simply perishable goods and the destruction of certain cargo. That is true, and that's certainly a function of time. So the more time that goods travel, that especially if they're not refrigerated, in some cases, then the odds of losing some of that outright is increasing. And what we're also seeing during Sandy is the damage that can be done to automobiles. The port has a relatively large activity when it comes to automobile trade. And so just simply destroying autos while they're still in the port is just going to be a significant issue. I believe during Sandy, there were several thousand cars that were destroyed as a result of the seawater. And sort of not to be forgotten, but the smaller part of the pie here is also the additional cost, marginally speaking, that agencies may have to spend in organization in order to, clean up during the event and afterwards, and just simply manage some of this. So for the port, we then, if we break it out like this and by time period, you can see how this sort of stacks up from relatively small for one day, which really is all just sort of the delay cost. You have delays in the supply chains. You basically have to pay more for warehousing of goods while they're in transit. And that goes up. And after a while, what kicks in is the additional transportation or rerouting cost. At which point now you're trucking and now you're using other modes of transportation to bring this cargo to their final destination. It is also worthwhile to think about how the port actually functions as a delivery point. So there's an intermittent point for cargo to travel, outside of the region. So it arrives here from wherever it's coming from, and then travels to Chicago, travels up the coast of Boston, travels even further inland. So there's sort of this point of interchange is significant, and when the delay gets longer, at some point rerouting is going to take different shapes and forms here. So what we try to do is look at the cargo, try to come up with a realistic scenario so that the rerouting would occur in line with the capacity limits at some of the other ports that would be utilized. And and then also when there's, capacity is essentially met at some of the other ports, there will be additional delays for, just waiting until cargo is processed, can move out. And so we try to all group this into our estimate. You can see how some of these costs, they rise at some point on an average day basis. That's the bottom row. The sort of you're reaching the highest peak there because at some point, there are structural changes that are being made. And so this changes dynamically over time. I mean, it's not going to drop back massively here, but at least it gives you a little bit of some of the dynamic nature that we try to capture with our analysis. The World Trade Center. Do you want, Chris, are you taking over now?
I can do that. Assuming I can figure out Zoom and I remember how to use it.
You want me to I can just run your slides if you want.
Yeah, let me give it a shot. I can share the screen here, right? Let's see. If I try. Okay. So someone shout if you're not seeing slides right now.
No, we're seeing slides. Just turn it to slide mode and then continue from here. Yeah.
How's that?
There you go. It's good.
Okay. So just to build a little bit on, thanks, Alex. Just to build a little bit on this opportunity concept that Alex was talking about a few minutes ago, the sort of the how-to when it comes to evaluating the non-physical damage from a disruption like a storm. With an event like a storm, we're interested in understanding the physical damage. Okay, I don't want to give the impression that we don't think about physical damage when we think about economic consequence. It's just that that's sort of easy to do across disciplines, or at least it's easier to conceptualize. It's this disruption, the methods associated with estimating that disruption and then adding dollar figures to it. There is a lot of economic methodology out there to put dollars to it. This is different than accounting cost. That's the physical impact. And the real key to this type of analysis is this counterfactual that Alex was just talking about. You're imagining life without an asset, and then you're imagining life with the asset. And this isn't specific to resilience economics. It's really used for any type of asset evaluation. When you're thinking about resilience, you're just taking it and adding a probabilistic element. And you can think about it you can use it to evaluate measures meant to protect against things like terrorism, which Alex was talking about, or things like storms, et cetera. So moving on to the World Trade Complex, I'm referring to not just the One World Trade Center, it's the entire complex of buildings and attractions down near the Hudson River in Lower Manhattan. There's One World Trade Center, that's the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere. And then there are a number of other office buildings down there that the complex replaced the original complex that was destroyed in September 11th. And it's got a number of office buildings. It's got a small park It's got a memorial and a museum. It's got the Oculus Transportation Hub. And we treated, Alex was referring to this need, this assumption you have to make when we do this analysis to isolate the effect of a storm or an event on a given asset or location. So we treated that entire site, the World Trade Center complex, as one place and sort of switched the on-off switch for this evaluation. This was probably the more complicated, maybe the most complicated of the 5 mini analyses we did as part of this effort, because we needed to account for multiple uses of that site. The office space there falls under general office use, and that's treated one way in economic analysis. Then there's the retail shops underneath the site, and that's treated another way in economic analysis. Then there's a path station actually built into the complex, and that's treated a third way. So when you add that up, commuter delay and productivity losses from that temporary absence of office space, those amounted to collectively the biggest impact. Retail was actually pretty minor. Let's see. Just a couple of broad assumptions that we had to make here. I'm not going to read this whole list, but as I was mentioning, we assume that the entire site shuts down, but that the region in general as business as usual. It gets back to business following a storm, and the site's shut down for a matter of time. We assume that when World Trade Center goes down, that the path station is out of use, and also, if you're familiar with the PATH train, also that the exchange place stop across the river, across the Hudson, that's shut down too. There's a big symbiosis between people getting on and off at exchange place, and then origins and destinations at World Trade. We assume that people working at World Trade Center, when the site's out of commission, stay home, but many of them can work from home. In fact, we had to develop sort of from scratch, we had to develop some remote work assumptions to build into a number of these analyses, including the World Trade Center effort, that we're now finding are useful as we're living life in the pandemic. And we have to think a little more critically about work from home, what it means now to economic activity, and what it could mean in a year from now. So we made some assumptions regarding how productive you could be at home. We assumed, for example, that people were about half as productive on day one. And that might seem low. I know there are a number of surveys out there and some evidence that's emerging that we can be very productive at home. But keep in mind that this is evaluating a storm and a shutdown that lasts, say, 3 days, where companies and workers didn't have a lot of time to get ready. That would take a bite out of potential productivity, arguably. And then that productivity grows as time goes on before capping up around 75, 80, 90% 3 weeks in. At the time we did this, which is a couple of years ago now, One World Trade Center was about 2/3 or 3/4 full. And the metrics that we use for all of this analysis, a lot of them are publicly available, and the methodology that you can find in a number of places to replicate this type of work just suggests using those published metrics as proxies for economic value. So for example, here we were using published wage data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to understand what an absence of an hour or a day of work would mean for the economy. And then we just have to add on a little bit for employer benefits. We use 50%, it's a nice round number. So you can see here that the impact, the estimates of total impact to the site. The wages lost, the first couple of rows, those were the biggest benefits, the biggest contributor to the impact. And the total economic consequence runs to about $12 million a day. But that gets chopped by about 1/3 once we start to account for remote work, and then gets chopped a bit more as time goes on. So the tunnels and bridges and terminals. The Port Authority owns 6 crossings, and they're highlighted here on this map. 3 of them connect to Manhattan. It's the 2 bridges, the Hudson and Lincoln, and then the George Washington Bridge furthest to north. But for this analysis, we just focused on the Hudson and Lincoln tunnels. They're the 2, they're the 2 tunnels that we have that connect to New Jersey. And Holland carries traffic from I-78 into Manhattan. Lincoln is part of Greater Route 495. The George, we just looked at it and we saw what happened in Sandy to the tunnels. We saw the absence of major impact on the George, and we just focused on the low-hanging fruit to keep things simple for now. It's true that really every asset in the region is at risk, but we wanted to keep things manageable and realistic when we were thinking about the highest probability of a major storm. So we focused on the 2 tunnels. And those tunnels were, they were really nailed, as I'll show. You know what, let me touch on this for a second. Focusing on the tunnels instead of all our crossings meant something that I think it's worth noting here. It minimizes the role of freight. There's either little to no freight going through the tunnels, depending on which one you're looking at. But, and that meant that most of this work, when we're crunching numbers, focuses on the impact to commuters and general travelers, tourists, et cetera. But as we're going to see later, and as we kind of saw in the numbers that Alex was just talking about at the port, freight carries a pretty big bang for the buck when you talk about adding delays. One reason is that it carries a big hourly impact. You delay freight, that really disrupts the supply chain, particularly when you get beyond a day or a couple of days. Also, when we simulate shutting down a tunnel or 2, commuters have a few options. Remember this assumption that Alex was talking about, that we imagine life without an asset and we imagine the region around it generally working as normal. Well, that means if a commuter, for example, can't use the tunnel, he or she might have an option to the south and taking the train. He or she might have an option of taking New Jersey Transit to the north, or getting in a car and traveling across the George or a bridge to the south. But with freight, those options become limited. And the freight doesn't have an option of working from home. So when you start delaying freight, you can get dollar figures that add up pretty quickly. And if I can get this, fingers crossed, video to play. The storm damage at Holland and Lincoln was pretty significant. When we look at all of the assets at the port that demanded quite a bit of internal attention after the storm in terms of estimating damage, putting together numbers to support requests for federal funding, et cetera. The Holland is the one I'm most familiar with, but the Holland and Lincoln demanded quite a bit of attention. They really got nailed. So just applying some of the same assumptions as with the World Trade Center and the port and then PATH, we assumed that most people physically came to work. A portion worked remotely in this simulation of having the tunnels out of service. And we adjusted for productivity. We assumed slightly different assumptions for people traveling for things other than work. And that we had to do that because we know that travelers have different sort of sensitivities or elasticities when it comes to making their decisions in the absence of the most reasonable or easiest path between A and B. Tourists, for example, versus commuters. We used published drive times using centroids across different counties. So the origin and destination counties in New Jersey, and then a centroid for Manhattan. And we used published data on weighted average drive times between those locations. So again, freight analysis can be similar to passenger analysis. We just have to make some different assumptions. I talked about this a little bit earlier. Some of the other metrics that are used for analysis of surface transportation, a bigger role for things like emissions, operating costs, fuel consumption. These all come into the broader umbrella of economic analysis because it's all about opportunity costs. What might if you have a longer drive, you're using more fuel, you're emitting more. Well, what could that money that would have gone for fuel, what could that have gone for? It really could have gone for more purposes than you can count. And it all comes into this tally of accounting for opportunity costs. Then we had to account for things like vehicle occupancy, which is going to be different for buses, as for cars, as for trucks. And the final step involves a recognition of network effects. That's down near the bottom. If your eyes are straying through this big table, down near the bottom you'll see a mention of congestion. So we do some simulations for reappropriating travelers here or there. And then we need to add a factor to account for the fact that those other travel alternatives are going to get adjusted. That's a big, it's something that's it's important to account for, because not only does that added congestion mean it's an extra few minutes beyond what that traveler might have expected by switching routes, that slowdown, that extra 10 minutes, for example, applies not only to that individual, but also to everyone who is riding that train or taking that bridge before and would have been doing so in the absence of this change. So those network effects can have a big impact on this type of analysis. We used a rule of thumb, 10% in this case. So summarizing here, the daily averages for tunnel disruptions, you can get up into the 9 million range for total impacts for freight. And the, this is freight, excuse me. So, and then that gets added to the total. It looks like we're missing a slide. Well, the numbers here, I'll jump back to the main table for the total numbers, but this wound up adding up to become one of the medium range impacts across these facilities. The Port Authority owns all 3 major airports in the region. It's JFK, Newark, and LaGuardia. And then it also owns 3 smaller airports, Stewart, Teterboro, and Atlantic City. Well, so if you see lists of activity ranked by airport in the US, you're not going to see the region's airports topping that list. But if you add it up, this is the biggest airspace in the country. It's also the busiest airspace with respect to international. And that's a distinction worth making, because for the same reason that we're valuing freight differently than passengers in the tunnels and bridges analysis I was just talking about, we're valuing travel by type a little bit differently when you start thinking cross-sectionally across things like, okay, business travel versus leisure, or international versus domestic. So focusing on air travel meant focusing again on passengers. There's not a ton of freight relative to other airports moving through the region. And plus, like I was mentioning, we value air passenger time a little bit higher than surface transportation. And then we also have to account for airlines in a way that we might not in surface transportation or transit. For economic analysis, we're trying to capture all of the stakeholders involved with an economic question. And when we're dealing with airspace and air activity, we're talking about the airlines. Airlines are private sector operators. It's not a transit agency. They have fairly large margins, and they get counted as part of an economic analysis, a look into economic consequences of shutdown. That's important for airlines, and it adds up pretty quick. So a couple of assumptions here. We cap the daily loss at 8 hours, just to keep things simple and to recognize the fact that there's quite a bit of business travel that we're dealing with. We assume, again, a productivity factor when we're thinking about business travel, because just because someone's stranded at or from their destination does not mean they're not getting any work done. It means that they're losing some of the economic value from that trip, and we can value that trip at willingness to pay, basically what someone was going to shell out or did shell out for that trip, and then assume that they got some of that by being, even though they were stuck. So you can notice that the results vary a bit by airport, but when you think about per passenger, this evens out. Passenger type does tilt the scales a little bit. So if we think about JFK, it's an incredibly international group of passengers moving into and out of that airport. If you think about LaGuardia, it's very business heavy. But on the net, if I were to take these rows, the first day total about halfway down the table, the 3-day total at the bottom of the table, and I divide by number of passengers, it starts to balance out a little bit. I think this is just the 7-day extension and the 30-day extension. So the PATH train connects Lower Manhattan and Midtown Manhattan to Jersey City, to Hoboken, and to Newark. And most of it was built 110 years ago. It was really the rise of automobile travel and congestion on the bridges and tunnels or excuse me, the construction, the building of bridges and tunnels that sent the original operator of PATH into bankruptcy in the 1950s. So if you're not familiar with the history of the PATH train, the Port Authority agreed to buy it from receivership in the early 1960s. That was part of the deal that actually cleared the way for construction of the original World Trade Center. So much of this system is really old. It is a much smaller sister to the subway system in New York, the New York City subway. But on a standalone basis, it's still one of the biggest 10 or 20 subway systems in the country. So for this analysis of a shutdown of PATH, we really as a group benefited from the fact that PATH disruptions had happened. Sandy shut down PATH for quite a bit of time, in some cases months, and if you're talking about on a partial basis, it's taken years to rebuild part of the system. So we needed to put together as an agency estimates of that shutdown for applications for federal funding. And a lot of that work was left over when we came along, Alex, I guess it was a couple of years ago, to do this analysis. So the process here might provide some illustration for the processes that we walked through before. So basically taking the last first. What we did was we put together a grid of origins and destinations, not only where people are going to and where they're coming from, but also the rough travel times associated with each of those legs. And then we clustered them into groups. Taking those groups, you can estimate the next best transport option for each group. So it's like a route group, if you've done travel analysis before. And we can repeat that exercise for clusters of time and day. So basically the table you're seeing here, we can repeat it. We start with peak hour or rush hour travel on weekdays. Then we can set up an alternative group of numbers for off-peak travel during the week. And then we can do it again for weekends. And that was then, those basically provided the building blocks for an estimate of the impact of travel time disruption. But down at the bottom right, we added the same remote work assumptions that we were doing with the tunnels, with the World Trade Center, and something similar to what we did with airports. So the summary results here, they surprised some people at the agency. They were the smallest batch of the bunch. And I think we sat back as a group and we scratched our head a little bit when we saw the numbers compared to the rest, but then we remembered that PATH is, as I was mentioning, it's a small portion of a broader regional transit and subway network. You have New Jersey Transit, to some extent Amtrak, you've got New York City Subway, the gorilla in the room. Had we done this for all of those and evaluated the shutdown to transit, we would have had very different results. Nonetheless, we're still talking about big dollars here, millions and millions, and then tens of millions of dollars, depending on the time associated with a broad shutdown of the system. So just to touch on some of the resources and the methodology that we used. This is, just to repeat, a methodology that's specific to using opportunity cost of losing a service. What happens when you don't use the service or we're not using the resources to protect the service? It's not accounting cost. We're not tallying the physical impacts. That's a little bit easier to conceptualize. And Alex used the term decision makers before. So public decision makers, they regularly are needing to rank or prioritize infrastructure projects, resilience infrastructure projects included, or they're needing to make discrete yes or no decisions on a project or a proposal. So all of the work that we're focusing on today is basically involved with, and is really at the center of the work involved with making a business case for those projects. A business case, if someone says, make a case for a resilience project or for protecting an asset or for protecting a power substation, et cetera. Those can be qualitative and sort of built on institutional knowledge and intuition, but they can be quantitative. It's not as easy as estimating a cost, but the methods are out there. US Office of Management and Budget, US DOT, FEMA, those guys all publish and update methods associated with the the analyses that we've been focusing on, which Alex mentioned. It's closely aligned to cost-benefit analysis, and it really just adds this probabilistic element to it. Could this happen? What's the probability of it happening? And what does it mean if it happens in dollars terms? So climate resilience projects, they aim to protect infrastructure. And this is really a way of saying, what are you getting for that protection? It's not an easy challenge to answer, but this is all about informing decisions. So we've touched on a few concepts. How would we like to do the question and answer? Adea, what do you think?
We could take some questions now. We have one in the chat here, folks. If you want to put your questions in, go right ahead. The one here is from Ben Wallen. Is there a best practice to communicate these costs to help change policy and the stigma of paying for prevention versus repair?
Okay, maybe we want to take 2 or 3 questions. I jotted that down.
Okay, let's see. I'm navigating over Q&A since there's 2 places people could do it. I only see that one right now. Maybe they weren't prepared.
Yeah, that was the only question that was out there at this time.
Okay.
I can take it, or we can unmute. We can do whatever you like.
Why don't you take that one, give people a minute to put some questions in there, and if we don't get new questions, we can just go through yours.
Yes, the best practice for communicating this type of analysis is to put it in a language that decision makers might be used to. And because we're talking about building a business case with analysis like this, you want decision metrics. And in the financial world, someone would be asking, what's the return on investment? So if I'm making an investment by way of a storm surge barrier, or if I'm elevating a site so that it's protected from a flood, or if I'm proposing some other $2 million, $10 million, $100 million resilience project to protect an asset or a group of assets, the return in the financial world would be ROI, return on investment. And for stuff like this, you're developing a ratio. Most commonly, you can use a net present value and a ratio. And the ratio is just a benefit cost ratio. So you take all of these numbers that we're focusing on here, you add the physical protection, the thing that we said we were very clear that we're not doing with this analysis. You add that physical protection, the avoided damage physically. You combine them and you divide them by you add a probabilistic element, and you divide it by the investment. So those are pretty common. If you're dealing with decision makers, let's say you're applying to FEMA for a grant and you've got a resilience project. FEMA is going to be looking for your benefit cost ratio, which takes the work that we've done, adds a couple of other elements, and gives you a metric. So in terms of the stigma, I don't know what you think, Alex, but I think those metrics, a ratio or a net present value, are ways to sort of point to a standardized methodology that the economics community has accepted as a way to evaluate resilience.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to this, I think that ultimately, what's been frequently communicated to the public is the replacement cost of an asset, right? So I think that's the much more common metric that is usually talked about. How much does it cost to replace a tunnel, to build additional redundancy? What is the cost to rebuild, in place, in kind, whatever the scope is. And like we were saying in the beginning, I'm not trying to diminish that point. That's fine. You should look at what the costs are, and actually you should be looking at if it makes sense to rebuild the same way that it existed before it might have been damaged or destroyed. I think what we're saying is that there's sort of an additional component, which in many cases is left out. If it's not just, a bunch of economists talking about what the net present value of the next 50 years of, probabilistic analysis of future impacts is. So I think it's really just a question of getting those topics on the table and thinking about assets in the way that you should be thinking about them in a prioritized way, right? So, I've come across a lot of people, the more concrete we're talking about, the more an asset is appreciated. But that's not always, it's a function of what kind of economic activity does that asset support? And I think that brings up a whole new set of questions.
So if I may ask a question, this is Eric Backus, one of the members of the steering committee for the series. And in 2017, the National Institute of Building Sciences put out a report called Resilience Pays, and they had some great ratios in there, X to 1, where by taking resilience measures and looking at mitigation measures, that there was a 4 to 1 or 7 to 1 or 8 to 1 even, long-term positive impact by doing resilience projects. Did you guys take a look at that in regards to this? Because I think that was really looking at what you were just talking about, Alex, which was kind of that simpler analysis. I'd be curious, if those ratios are maybe understated by virtue of what you have presented here in terms of the economic impacts, and your thoughts and your and Chris's thoughts in regards to that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't recall. I remember seeing it. I don't remember, looking too closely at the methodology, or at least I don't recall that at the time. I think as long as a study looks at what the potential losses from, if nothing is done, what the productivity losses are in the long term, then that's essentially along the same lines of what we were just talking about. So how much of a productivity and output focused metric do you sustain by investing in infrastructure that is resilient today, or in processes that are resilient? Doesn't necessarily have to be infrastructure. I think that's the right lens. I wouldn't be surprised if, you look at some of that. This is a relatively large, payback essentially from an economic perspective, because if you think about this, these are recurring, right? So this is an annual flow concept of economic activity. I mean, you have to probably overlay some measure of probabilistic analysis, because there's a certain probability that, you may be having your activity disrupted in any given year. But even so, and then you project this out over the next couple generations, if that's the kind of project you're talking about, I think those numbers get large pretty quick. I think so I'm not necessarily surprised if that was a relatively healthy ratio, the way you're describing it.
So there's a question from the attendees, from an attendee.
Right. We have the one in the Q&A. What program does Port Authority New York, New Jersey have in place to identify resiliency projects? What physical improvements are they looking at for their various systems?
So the Port Authority has both sort of systematic and ad hoc efforts in place to understand the role of resiliency and in asset construction and replacement. And a lot of it's focusing on, and then it has sort of running plans that resiliency finds a role in. So one of the ways that resiliency has been baking its way into the agency's bloodstream, I'm mixing metaphors here, but it is through power substations. So I think starting a few years ago, I've been at the agency 5 years, and shortly after I got there, you could sense that the agency was starting to see opportunities to develop resiliency solutions when it has to replace power substations. So instead of trying to shoehorn and force resiliency into an asset that's already developed, resiliency measures started to become slowly part of the DNA of developing a replacement for an existing asset. And that's another way of saying that during my time there, I've helped with quite a few project development efforts regarding power substations. There was this recognition, in the case of an emergency, not having power makes recovery that much more difficult. So it's a critical need in terms of preparing for major events. And resiliency analysis has gone into evaluating the question of replacing, to Alex's point just a few minutes ago, replacing a power substation as it is or elevating it. Do you elevate it by 3 feet? Do you replace it where it is? Do you do something else? So that's been a place for where this systematic consideration of resilience has started to show up on a regular basis.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think, and just as a general comment, I think it's important to realize, and I think a lot of the very capable former colleagues of mine at the Port Authority have done that to varying degrees, is you need to have data. You need to have some sense of your assets. You need to conduct vulnerability assessments on an ongoing basis. You need to have engineering data on where your asset is in its replacement cycle, so you can actually understand and decide what makes sense and where is it worth spending money and where is it maybe worth to just rethink an entire process. I think that's the sort of ongoing need for better data and better systems, I think is critical in all of this.
Oops. Let me, I think there was a need to develop some Q&A as part of the protocol, Medea. So why don't I just walk quickly through a couple of learning questions and answers.
Great.
And then we can come back to questions. How's that?
Sure, that sounds great.
All right, so we thought at the front end of this about the general objective of the presentation and put together a few questions with answers. So just going from 1 through 5 here on slide 34. What are the 2 key ways to estimate and measure a major storm's impact on transport infrastructure? Well, from early on the presentation, slides 4, 5, slide 7, there's the monetary value of asset destruction, physical destruction. And that's the one that I think is easiest for most people to conceptualize. And then second, there's the economic consequence from the temporary loss of operations, the sort of the loss of what that asset does. And that's the second key way to estimate and measure the impact. So how does cost-benefit analysis apply to these estimates, and what does it try to do? I think this goes to the first question we just discussed a few minutes ago. So with infrastructure cost-benefit analysis, you're trying to compare the benefits of protecting infrastructure against the cost of providing that protection. That becomes a decision metric. You're taking the upside of what you get from a protective measure and you're balancing it against what it costs to provide that protection. And the ways to do that are the answers to number 1. Those are the inputs, along with cost. So what's number 3? What's a key assumption that might need to be taken to estimate the impact of an operational disruption to a transport facility? Okay, so Alex was alluding to this. If we went too fast on this, it definitely is worth spending some time thinking about. The disruption impacts should be narrowly focused on the facility you're analyzing. You need to be focusing on what happens with or without that asset in service. Or somehow, I mean, to put it another way, somehow the analysis should stop short of assuming other impacts to the economy. If a facility is down, it's generally business as usual and everywhere else. We touched on this on slide 8, by the way. Number 4, what metrics might be used to estimate an operational disruption to an airport? So if we're thinking about that economic consequence, you're counting the inconvenience to passenger travel in terms of hours or days of delay or lost travel. And then, in using this example, you're also considering the loss in profit experienced by an airline. And when we're thinking about airlines, that's a pretty big number. Even a matter of a number of hours or a couple of days can really ding an airline's operations. And number 5, where can someone go for technical guidance regarding estimation of these impacts? That was just a slide ago, I believe. There's a lot of published literature and a recommended guidance out there from the US Department of Transportation, FEMA, Management and Budget Office, et cetera. So let's see, we have another question in the queue here. Sarah.
Yeah, I can take that if you want me to.
Fire away.
So the question was about if there was any specific design storm frequency that we used for this analysis. And I think, while we did a lot of work on frequency of storms, severity of impact, and what some of the projections and the likely probability outcomes in future years might look like, basically the analysis provides a snapshot in time. So it's basically just says, well, if a facility is shut down, this is what the consequence is. You can then take those kind of estimates and string them together with a sense of, what the likelihood is of a certain years based on certain underlying projection to come up with a probability adjusted total, present value estimate. But otherwise, it wouldn't play into this.
Basically, what you're seeing is the analysis of losing, let's say, the airports. You're looking at an analysis of losing the airports for 3 days, right? So just pick one data point from the airports table. So what happens if we lose the airports for 3 days? The probability distribution would be the next step. It's saying, okay, we've got something that we think protects the airports and keeps us from losing the airports for 3 days. Maybe it's backflow preventers or something like that, right? Or a seawall or something. Then the probabilities associated with that come into play after that. So what Alex and I have walked through is sort of the first building block. What's the estimate? What's the likelihood of this happening or of something happening that you could protect against? Then you've got an expected value. So there's that, remember that old equation, your expected value is just your potential value times the probability. What we've shown you is the potential value.
Excellent. I put out a last call for questions. Going once.
Looks like we're all set.
Okay, excellent. That was terrific. Thank you.
Oh, question on if this is discrete shutdown or not, or if this is a slowdown as well. We've played, that's a good question. We played with this sort of thought of, well, does this really have to be a yes or no decision? And no, I mean, obviously, realistically, you can sort of think about this, an airport may never get fully shut down unless there's a real extreme circumstance. So it's a question of slowing down part of the activity. It's hard to do that and come up with sort of a, 25, 50, 70% case. So we figured let's just deal with the discrete choice of shutting down the facility. And then, as a next best alternative, you could just proportionally scale it in terms of how you think about let's say, slow down by 50%. But we didn't really, there seemed to be too much dynamic modeling necessary to actually do this.
But yeah, and I'll just add to that, Alex. Michael, just because we didn't do it as part of this analysis doesn't mean it's not closely related to this work, right? For example, a non-storm related analysis that we did at PATH focused on the loss of a group of track near outside the Newark stop. And that analysis basically said, okay, if we lose some power in and out of Newark, then trains would have to single track. And if trains single track, you've got lower frequency. And you've got lower frequency, you've got lower capacity. You've got some people riding the train, but a number of people jumping ship. I'm mixing metaphors again, but doing something else because they can't wait the train. So you could do that. We didn't include it as part of this analysis because it was, I guess, Alex, it was sort of a simplifying assumption for us to just say a facility was either in or not in operation, yes or no.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, presenters, Alex and Chris. I did want to introduce Eric Bacchus, who came on shortly while I was speaking earlier. He's part of our working group and the Professor of Practice and Executive Officer at Clarkson University. Also on and in the audience was Lieutenant Colonel Ben Wallen, Assistant Professor of Military of U.S. At the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, and Mike Scarano, PE, Senior Director of Capital Program Management, New Jersey Transit. All of us are the working committee that puts the seminar series together. So thank you, Alex. It was excellent presentation. Thank you, Chris. It was super. And everybody have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.